They had braced themselves for humiliation, for hunger, for punishment. What they did not prepare for was abundance. In the summer of 1944, a group of German women nurses, clerks, and auxiliary staff captured in France were transferred across the Atlantic and eventually allowed on carefully monitored excursions into American towns. When the prison trucks stopped outside a modest grocery store in rural Iowa, their guards ordered them to line up. The women expected perhaps a small general shop, dusty and half-empty, as they had known in Germany under rationing. Instead, the moment they crossed the threshold, they froze as though struck by lightning. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Shelves stretched the length of the store, lined not with a few dented tins but with towers of gleaming cans, boxes and jars. Bright labels of soups, fruits, and meats glowed in reds and yellows. A refrigerated counter displayed neat rows of milk bottles, their cream tops intact. Butter sat in wrapped bricks, stacked 3 deep. Even bananas exotic and impossible in wartime Germany rested in heavy bunches, waiting for anyone to purchase. The women exchanged glances but could not speak. They had never seen so much food in one place, not even before the war. For years in Germany, food had meant queues and ration cards. A pound of butter was a rare luxury. Meat was trimmed to the bone, sometimes substituted with ersatz products that tasted of sawdust and bitterness. Families boiled nettles to fill out soups. Mothers cut bread thinner each day to stretch the week's allowance. Now, only months later and an ocean away, these women stared at an America where food seemed to grow without limit, where war had not stolen the dinner table. The psychological blow struck harder than any weapon. A guard recalled later that the silence inside the store was unnerving. Normally the women whispered among themselves in defiance, but here they shuffled slowly, their eyes fixed on tins of peaches and pyramids of apples. One prisoner, a former secretary named Lotta, reached out her hand to touch a loaf of white bread wrapped in wax paper. She drew it back quickly, as though the bread were sacred. Another, Hildegard, later wrote in her diary, "We came prepared for hunger, for chains, for endless work. We were not prepared for a land where butter was piled higher than bricks in Berlin." This opening moment was not orchestrated propaganda. It was not a staged display for enemy eyes. It was simply an ordinary American supermarket in 1944 on an ordinary morning, with customers buying food for their families. But for the women who had known only shortages, black markets, and gnawing hunger, the sight was nothing less than a revelation. It was a silent yet devastating message while Germany fought desperately just to keep its population alive. The United States waged war and still filled its shelves with plenty. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? The women did not trust their own eyes. Standing in the aisles, they blinked as if to test whether the vision would vanish. Every direction offered another impossibility. Glass bottles of milk lined up in perfect rows, their caps sealed tight and their contents fresh. Golden blocks of butter stacked in refrigerated cases, as though the war outside the store's walls did not exist. Apples and oranges, polished to a shine, their colors vibrant against wicker baskets, and slabs of beef, pork, and chicken waiting behind glass counters, tended by uniformed butchers who greeted customers with polite smiles. For these women, most born between 1915 and 1920, milk had long been rationed even before their capture in Germany. By 1943, a child was lucky to see half a liter per week. Adults rarely tasted it at all. Meat had become a phantom, reserved for soldiers at the front, while civilians survived on watery stews and bread stretched with fillers. Butter, when available, was carefully divided into slivers, its taste remembered more than savored. Yet here, in an ordinary American town, such goods were not rationed for the privileged or the powerful. They were simply available to everyone. A farmer's wife, shopping with 2 children in tow, pushed her cart past the prisoners. The little boy pointed to a display of bananas and laughed. The guard watching the prisoners noted how one German woman lowered her eyes and clenched her fists, as though the child's innocent laughter was unbearable. Another prisoner whispered under her breath in disbelief, "They buy meat like we buy coal." Her tone carried both wonder and resentment. The guards allowed the women only a short time inside. Yet those minutes imprinted themselves like scars. Even the sound of the checkout, the rhythmic clink of coins. The paper bags filling with goods struck the prisoners as surreal. In Germany, coins had lost meaning. Inflation and shortages made currency almost irrelevant. Here, in America, the currency of war seemed to be plenty itself. Later, around the barracks table, arguments erupted. Was it possible this was real? Could America truly maintain such abundance while fighting wars in Europe and the Pacific? Some claimed it was staged for their benefit. A clever illusion. Others, recalling the weary faces of real shoppers, insisted no propaganda machine could choreograph the casual rhythm of housewives buying bread for dinner. Numbers told the truth. By 1944, American farmers produced nearly 127 million tons of grain, an increase even during wartime. Meatpacking plants processed billions of pounds of pork and beef, while dairy farms supplied milk not only for civilians, but also for soldiers fighting abroad. The scale was overwhelming. The women had walked into more than a store. They had walked into a revelation of industrial power, one that fed both battlefield and homefront alike. That evening, a hush fell over the barracks. No one spoke as the guards distributed supper trays, beans, bread, and even a small pat of butter. For the first time, the women did not complain about camp food. Their silence was not satisfaction, but disbelief. They had seen the proof with their own eyes, and it unsettled them more than hunger ever had. The memory of those supermarket aisles followed the women back through the gates of their camp. Barbed wire, watchtowers, and wooden barracks could not erase the image of shelves stacked higher than their heads with foods once reserved for holidays back in Germany. At night, lying on thin mattresses, they whispered to each other in disbelief. Was this truly America's everyday reality, or had they been paraded through a theater set designed to fool them? Suspicion ran deep. One prisoner, Erica, a 32-year-old clerk from Hamburg, insisted the entire excursion had been staged. She whispered that the bread might have been brought in from across the state just for their visit. Others challenged her. "Did you not see the children?" Hildegard replied. The mothers did not act. They were not soldiers in disguise. They were real, and they shopped like it was nothing. The debate split the group. Some clung to the belief that their captors had engineered a trick, for admitting the truth meant questioning everything they had been taught about their homeland's strength. Outside, the American supply trucks rumbled through with the same steady rhythm. Drivers unloaded crates of milk and fresh vegetables destined for the camp kitchens. To the women, it was both humiliating and undeniable. Even their prison rations, meager compared to those of free Americans, contained more protein and variety than what many civilians in Berlin or Hamburg received during those desperate years. In 1945, the average German civilian subsisted on fewer than 1,500 calories per day. In contrast, U.S. Army guidelines required that prisoners of war receive around 2,500, a bitter irony not lost on the women behind the fence. One afternoon, as trucks unloaded bread, two guards joked about which bakery baked softer loaves. The German women, listening, felt a pang of fury. In their homes, bakeries had shuttered, flour had been stretched with acorns or potatoes, and bread was coarse, dark, and scarce. Here, in a land at war, soldiers compared brands of bread as though it were a matter of taste, not survival. The gossip inside the barracks turned darker. Some accused their homeland's leaders of betrayal. How could Germany ask for such sacrifice when America had the means to live so comfortably? Others, more fearful, argued that such talk was dangerous and unpatriotic. A few simply fell silent, staring at their hands, unwilling to admit that their inner certainty was cracking. A diary entry, later found in the belongings of a prisoner named Marta, captures this conflict. "I cannot sleep. I see milk in bottles. I hear the sound of coins at the counter. It is not possible, and yet it is. What have we done? What have we believed?" The supermarket visit became an invisible weapon, not through speeches, not through slogans, but through silent proof. It was a weapon that struck deeper than bombs, for it attacked the foundation of belief itself. Behind barbed wire, disbelief began to corrode certainty, and certainty began to give way to doubt. The delivery trucks arrived at dawn, their engines rattling against the stillness of the camp. Dust rose from the gravel road as crates of vegetables, bread, and milk were unloaded at the gate. to the prisoners. The sight carried a sting. The same trucks that supplied ordinary American families were also tasked with feeding their captives. The humiliation was subtle but piercing. In Germany, they had starved while loyal to their nation. Here, in enemy territory, they were nourished by the very people they had been taught to despise. American agriculture had achieved something unprecedented during the war. Despite millions of men leaving farms for the armed forces, U.S. farmers harvested record yields. In 1944 alone, wheat output soared past 1 billion bushels, while corn harvests reached an astonishing 3.2 billion. Mechanization, government subsidies, and the labor of women and migrant workers sustained the momentum. For the German women confined behind barbed wire, these numbers were not abstract statistics. They were lived reality, visible in the endless flow of food that entered both camps and supermarkets. One guard, a young man from Nebraska, casually told a group of prisoners that his family farmed over 1,000 acres of corn. The women laughed bitterly at what they thought was exaggeration. In their homeland, a farm of 50 acres could sustain a family. The idea of a single farm stretching across horizons seemed impossible. Yet later, when newspapers reached the camp, they read about American farms spanning counties, supported by tractors, combines, and rail networks. Their laughter turned into quiet recognition the guard had not been boasting. He had simply described everyday reality. Among the women, envy mixed with despair, Hildegard, the nurse, recorded in her notebook, "They feed us white bread every week. In Leipzig, my nephew writes of eating potato peels. I eat better in captivity than he does in freedom." Her words reveal the cruelty of contrast, the enemy's prisoners receiving more nourishment than the children of loyal Germans. The camp kitchens, though basic, reflected this abundance. Bowls of beans, carrots, and bread were distributed, sometimes accompanied by meat stews. The women remembered how, in Germany, neighbors had fought over scraps at markets or scoured fields for turnips after bombings. Here, food was plentiful enough that guards occasionally tossed leftovers into bins without ceremony. Such casual waste cut deeper than any punishment. One afternoon, as bread was served, Erica asked aloud the question none dared voice directly. If America can feed its people like this, why did we ever think we could win? Silence followed. The other women lowered their eyes. It was not just a question about food, it was a question about the very foundation of their loyalty. By the time evening fell, the smell of baking bread still lingered in the barracks from the day's delivery. The women sat in rows, eating quietly. Some chewed slowly, savoring each bite as though it might reveal the secret of America's strength. Others stared at their plates, the humiliation too sharp to swallow. In those moments, the overflowing farms of the Midwest had done what speeches and bombs could not. They pierced pride and left only awe. As weeks passed, the shock of America's supermarkets lingered and whispered confessions and secret notes. The women who had once sworn loyalty to a Reich that promised glory now scribbled diary entries that spoke only of hunger, envy, and bewilderment. Among them was Hildegard, the nurse from Cologne, who carefully tucked away scraps of paper beneath her mattress. One fragment survives in Berlin. Children beg for crusts. Here, milk is poured like water. How can this be real? Another, Marta, wrote a letter she never sent, addressed to her sister still living in Hamburg. You will not believe me, but even prisoners here drink coffee in the morning. Bread is white, soft, and without ration cards. I dream of you standing in these aisles, crying as I did. Such words, dangerous in the camp's barracks, were shared in hushed tones and quickly hidden when footsteps approached. For the Americans, these details were routine. A guard recalled one prisoner staring at a grocery flyer that had been left on a bench. It listed weekly specials: oranges for a few cents a pound, beef cuts by the pound, coffee by the tin, to the German women. This flimsy sheet of paper was more shocking than the barbed wire itself. This is not propaganda, whispered Erica. This is their life, written in prices. The diaries tell us something raw. Food was not just nourishment, but humiliation, revelation, and temptation all at once. At night, in the barracks, arguments flared. Some accused the United States of flaunting wealth to break their spirit. Others admitted, with trembling voices, that they admired such abundance and wished it for their families back home. ideology, once so firm, was now weakened by butter and bread. Amid this turmoil, tears were not uncommon. One day, a prisoner named Lotta was seen crying quietly over a glass of milk she had been given with supper. Her fellow prisoners teased her at first, but she shook her head and muttered, "My son has not seen milk in years." The barracks fell silent. No one laughed again. That small glass of milk became heavier than chains, for it carried the weight of everything they had lost. By 1945, reports show that America exported nearly 10 million tons of food supplies to its allies while still maintaining full supermarket shelves at home. For women raised on propaganda about American weakness, this reality was unbearable and undeniable. Their letters, diaries, and whispered confessions became living testimony, small records that revealed how a nation's strength was measured not only by armies, but also by the fullness of its pantries. And now, let me ask you if you had been one of these women, stepping into a supermarket brimming with food while your family starved at home. What would you have felt first, gratitude, anger, or despair? Share your thoughts below your perspective. Matters. The shocks did not end with food inside those American supermarkets. Another sight unsettled the women even more deeply. Stock clerks, many of them young men, too old or unfit for service. Others immigrants, and even black workers moved confidently through the aisles, arranging fruit displays and carrying crates of butter to the German women, raised under years of propaganda that preached racial superiority. The vision was disorienting. Here, men and women they had been told were inferior were entrusted with keeping America's shelves overflowing, and they did so with efficiency and pride. In the barracks that night, voices rose in uneasy debate. Erica muttered that it was shameful to see Negroes working among the food of white families, but Marta countered, quietly but firmly. Did you see how the customers spoke to them? With respect, they trust them. The argument dissolved into silence, but the seed had been planted. Their certainty about Germany's ideology no longer stood unchallenged. The contradictions piled higher each day. A guard once explained that American women had taken jobs in factories, producing aircraft and munitions, while still ensuring that their children were fed at home. To the prisoners, this was unimaginable. In Germany, women scrounged for coal, queued for scraps, and mourned sons lost to the Eastern Front. In America, women welded steel and still found time to bake pies. It seemed like sorcery. Hildegard recorded another note. They told us America was rotten inside, but if this is decay, then what word do we use for Berlin's ruins? Her reflection was not unique. By 1945, more than 400,000 German prisoners had cycled through camps in the United States, and countless stories like hers emerged, for the female prisoners, especially. The confrontation with American plenty forced them to re-examine not just propaganda, but the very meaning of strength. And strength was everywhere. Statistics underscored what their eyes already knew in 1945 US. Factories turned out 96,000 planes, 57,000 landing craft, and millions of rifles while supermarkets remained stocked. America could fight across oceans and still provide butter and oranges to its children. That realization shook them more deeply than the sound of any bombing raid. One evening, as supper trays were handed out, Erica asked a question that hung in the air long after. If this is weakness, then what is strength? No one answered. The silence was heavier than the barbed wire outside. Now, I ask you, the audience when lies are exposed not by arguments but by ordinary scenes of life, milk bottles, bread loaves, families shopping without fear, do they wound deeper than weapons? Would such a revelation have changed your own beliefs? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. By the spring of 1946, the war had ended, and repatriation ships began carrying prisoners back across the Atlantic for the women who boarded those vessels. The journey home was marked not by triumph, but by memory, vivid, unshakable images of supermarket aisles, milk bottles, and bread loaves that haunted them more than the sight of Allied tanks. As the German coastline came into view, their homeland stood battered, cities reduced to rubble, and people still queuing for scraps. The contrast could not have been more merciless. Letters and diaries recovered years later testify to this psychological rupture. Marta, who returned to Hamburg, wrote, "When I saw our market, I wept. Here, a few wilted cabbages. There, children fighting over crusts. In America, even prisoners had butter. Her words became a whisper passed from one survivor to another, spreading a story that astonished those who had never left German soil. The supermarkets they had seen in Iowa, Kansas, or Texas became more than places of food. They became symbols of a different kind of warfare, the war of production, logistics, and abundance. America had fought with rifles and bombers, yes, but also with barns, factories, and shelves. That truth traveled home in the memories of women who once believed Germany invincible. Some carried bitterness. Lotta, still grieving the hunger her son had endured, told her neighbors, "We believed we were strong." But strength was there, across the ocean, in the fullness of their baskets. Others, though, spoke with awe. Hildegard confided to a priest in Cologne, "I envied them. Yes, but I also admired. They showed us what we never dreamed was possible." These words reveal a quiet transformation not of allegiance, but of perception. Historians later calculated that between 1943 and 1946, over 371,000 German prisoners lived in camps across the United States. Their experiences varied, but for the women who stepped into supermarkets, the lesson was unforgettable. They had seen with their own eyes a power built not only on steel and fire, but on bread and milk. It was a lesson no ideology could erase. The brimming shelves became an eternal symbol, one that followed them into old age. Even decades later, survivors would describe dreams of neon-lit aisles, the scent of coffee, and the soft touch of white bread. These were not luxuries, they were revelations. They proved that America's greatest weapon had been prosperity itself. As the ships docked and the women stepped onto German soil, their homeland felt smaller, grayer, and more fragile than ever before. In their minds lingered one enduring image: children in Iowa laughing at bananas, guards joking over brands of bread, mothers buying milk without fear. That image would remain long after uniforms were discarded and fences were torn down, a legacy of shock, envy, and reluctant admiration. When the war ended and the barbed wire came down, most of the women returned to their homes in a Germany scarred beyond recognition. Cities lay in ruins, factories were silent, and food was still scarce. Yet deep within them remained the vision of another world, a world that seemed almost mythical: supermarkets glowing with light, shelves bending under the weight of milk and butter, fruit stacked in bright colors that no bomb could dim. This memory, more than speeches or slogans, carried the quiet power of truth. For many, the contrast never faded, even years later. When Germany rebuilt and its own stores filled once more, some women would confess that nothing compared to that first encounter in America. It was not just the food, but the symbolism, the discovery that a nation could fight a global war and still allow its children to laugh over bananas and soft bread. It revealed that power is not only measured in tanks or rifles, but in the ability to provide, to sustain, and to overflow with life when others could barely survive. The human side of this story lingers in small details: a prisoner crying silently over a glass of milk, another clutching a grocery flyer as though it were evidence from another planet, guards joking about bread while their captives remembered hunger in ruined cities. These fragments form a mosaic of memory, each piece revealing how abundance itself became a weapon more devastating than any bomb. And so, the image endures: supermarket aisles stretching into the distance, a symbol of victory not won solely on battlefields, but in kitchens, farms, and homes, for the women who once walked those aisles in disbelief. It was the moment they understood that America's strength was not only in its armies, but in its plenty.